Have you gone to some plant stores to see what plants they have and then you just see some of the same old varieties? Or perhaps you like some of the common plants that you have, but just want to get something a little bit different? Well, I thought I'd do an episode today on substituting some of our more common plants with some more interesting ones that have similar care. So let's begin. Now, Pachira aquatica is otherwise known as the money tree, and you see this palmately leaved plant everywhere. And I mean, it's in supermarkets, it's in salons, bake shops, banks, bodegas, and yes, of course, plant shops. And you could definitely consider this like an old faithful plant, and it's probably one of the first plants that people get in their homes. I mean, I would even venture to guess that it's one of the first 10 plants that most of you have had in your collection. So let me know if that's the case in the comments below. Now, you probably have also seen Scheffleras out there because it's by no means like an uncommon plant, although not as ubiquitous as the money tree. Now, there are a couple different species out there that are sold on the market, but namely I want to focus on Schefflera actinophila, and this is also called the umbrella plant because it also has palmate-shaped leaves. Now, Scheffleras have these slightly thicker, more glossy leaves and leaflets, and if you compare that to the Pachira aquatica, this is a little bit more like papery, and I actually have to admit that I do like the fact that the leaves of the Schefflera are a little bit more thicker. And the one that I'm highlighting here is a cultivar of Schefflera actinophila called Schefflera actinophila nova, which has a little deviation in the leaflets, as you could see here, from the traditional Schefflera actinophila. And for those of you who have watched my 365 Days of Plants, then you may also recognize that I highlighted this one at some point. Anyway, the care for both the Pachira and Schefflera are not too dissimilar from one another, and both can actually get to be quite large specimens, unless maybe you choose to like bonsai them, which is also possible. But when I mean large, I mean, I see a Pachira aquatica in a nail salon that's growing probably 6 or 7 feet tall. And this one's actually gotten quite large. I mean, this one started off as like a pretty tiny one that I bought at a bodega. And then I've seen also Schefflera actinophila growing like 10, 11, 12 feet tall. There's one growing in a shop nearby. Okay, let's go to the next one. Okay, next on my list is the sometimes fickle spider mite attracting Hedera helix, or the typical English ivy. Now, lots of people love the idea of having ivy grow indoors and just the look of ivy in general, but some ivies are just a pain in the butt because, as many of my viewers have shared, it's a spider mite magnet. So if your ivy is getting you down, but you want something that looks like ivy and performs like ivy, then try the more succulent Senecio macroglossus, which is called wax ivy, even though it's not in the ivy family. Now, I will say that it doesn't cling to your walls the same way that ivy does, which I could fully attest to, and I think that's probably a good thing, because when I had to remove my Hedera helix gold heart, which by the way is a great cultivar, but when I had to remove it from my wall in order for the construction workers to actually get to my electricity and my windows, the Hedera helix like clung so much that I ended up having to rip off chunks of my paint in the wall in the process. So not something that I would totally recommend if you're in a rental like myself. But if you want something that's a little bit safer for your home, then I would say Senecio macroglossus is the way to go. And even though it's a little bit more succulent compared to the traditional ivy, but I think actually that's what makes it a bit better for growing indoors too. Now, believe it or not, even though the Senecio macroglossus is more succulent, I actually grow it in the same lighting conditions in the same window as my ivies. And instead of actually clinging and clasping, it more twines and climbs, so it's a little less clingy. All right, so we're going to go with the next one on the list. So let me cover the ears of this one by replacing your spider plant, otherwise known as Chlorophytum comosum. Now, I joke that this is a plant that doesn't want you to have any other plant in your collection because it just sends off so many offsets and wants to take over your whole place. Now I had one really, really early on and it just got so aggressive. I ended up just getting rid of it because I had to essentially had this like monoculture of spider plants. And my father is actually going through the same thing now at his home. Now every time I go back, it's literally his pothos and his spider plant that have taken over. I mean, really good for those plants, but if you want to try something a bit more unique, but still gives you those cute little offsets, then I would try your hand at a walking iris. Now, this is one that I'm pretty excited about and started experimenting with it last year after learning about it from the Mohunk Mountain greenhouses. And it also has this kind of punky style foliage, but it grows a little bit more in this like fan shape. And as you could see from this one of my specimens that I'm growing indoors, it will send off these little offsets, which I have another one growing in the back that has these little offsets starting. It doesn't put out a lot of offsets as Chlorophytum comosum does, but it does actually produce and send out those little shoots where the plants grow, hence the name walking iris. Now, there are several genera of walking irises, and this is in the genus Trimezia, but honestly, I can't even remember what species I have because I never actually formally marked all of them, and there's been quite a lot of movement, taxonomically speaking, within this family. So I will have to wait until they flower, if they ever flower, to actually get an ID on some of these species. Now, I can say that I planted some in hanging baskets, and those actually aren't doing as well. And I think because I tend to water them a lot less, so the ones on my shelves and on the floors are much easier for me to care for regularly and have performed the best for me. But for the most part, they don't need too different of care from your spider plants. Giving them that bright indirect light is going to be perfect for them. All right, next on my list is Schlumbergera. That's your Christmas or Thanksgiving cactus. And this type of jungle cactus is quite ubiquitous, especially during the respective holidays. But why not switch it up a bit with a different type of jungle cactus known as Phyphora? So this one is called Phyphora right here, and this one has much more succulent leaves, and it actually has cute orange flowers. Now, it doesn't have as bombastic of flowers as the Christmas or Thanksgiving cactus, but it actually does have something that is quite beautiful. And this was actually just in bloom in my house, I would say a number of months ago. I can't even remember when, but they bloomed for quite a long time. Now, I was actually going to also recommend Rhipsalis as an alternative, and this is a type of Rhipsalis that I have here, but Rhipsalis doesn't get as pretty of blooms, so it can be a different alternative, but it's just not going to have as showy of flowers. But they still have noticeable enough blooms that they're like white or yellowish color, and then they get these little berries at the end, which is also quite cool. So I would recommend any of these as they're actually quite similar in care. Lastly, the ever-present Phalaenopsis orchid. I mean, can you ever replace this orchid? Well, maybe not for the blooms, but why not try a bit more of a tougher orchid like Rhipsalis, which also happens to be just in bloom, which I was really excited about. This one I actually have growing in more direct light, and the ones that I do have growing in more direct light seem to bloom more frequently and more vigorously than the ones that I have growing in my northeast window, for example. And again, remember, I'm in the northern hemisphere. This is a terrestrial orchid, so it's a little bit easier to care for. And of course, their blooms are not as big and as bright as you'd say in the Phalaenopsis, but again, really beautiful leaf color, and also I would say much smaller blooms, but something that's still beautiful that you can appreciate. Now, if you want to go with another alternative, then you could try a lady slipper orchid like a Paphiopedilum, which mine at the moment is not blooming, as it was blooming throughout January and February, but it does get quite a gorgeous bloom. Okay, next up. So I featured both of these actually in my 365 Days of Plants, although a different kind of cultivar, but you are probably familiar with Dracaenas, and Dracaenas are quite a common houseplant. It might be one of the first ones that you've gotten, and they're relatively easy houseplants to care for. I think this is the cultivar named Sunray, and it has these really lanceolate type style leaves, and it often has this kind of woody stem. But one of the ones that I had been introduced to mainly when I was in Florida at the Fairchild Tropical Botanic Gardens is the Pandanus. And this is actually used in Filipino culture, making and flavoring rice, which is super neat. And so I have an all green version, and then I have this one, which is a variegated version. And again, it's very similar to the Dracaena, and it has these lanceolate style leaves and has, again, very similar form. So this one would be such an interesting one to be able to substitute for Dracaena. I think it looks very similar, has a little bit of a thicker leaf. I think is actually just as easy to take care of, but likes to be in a slightly more well-lit location. I think you could get away with having your Dracaenas in a little bit more of a lower light location, but Dracaenas also respond very well to bright light. So I would say that this one is going to be better with bright light and can handle a little bit more watering as well. All right, guys, I hope that gave you some new ideas for what plants that you may want to try your hand at in growing indoors. I think all of these would make terrific substitutes and will actually shake things up a little bit. All right, guys, see you next time. If you didn't hear yet, we just released Houseplant Basics, which is an introductory mini course for beginner houseplant enthusiasts. The video-based course is set up to be both concise and comprehensive, and it serves as a perfect primer for our Houseplant Masterclass, which is a month-long course on houseplant care, cultivation, and more. You can find out more information on both courses at homesteadbrooklyn.com or search for the courses in the description below.